explore new worlds and ideas. Support your PBS station.
There's no question ever about who the greatest comedian is. It's never anything other than Richard Pryor. They created the 5-second delay on Saturday Night Live because of Richard Pryor.
You ever notice how right they get outside, they talk to everybody, right? Hi, how you doing? I don't know you, but here's my wife. Hello.
He was not trying to be the proper black man. Richard Pryor was very much trying to be a nigger.
Richard Pryor was born on the edge. Imagine being born in a brothel. People weren't comfortable with where he was coming from. And Rich was like, well, this is where I'm from. This is what I've been through. This is my life. I'm gonna tell it.
Richard Pryor, the comedian, was badly burned in an accident at his home in California last night. They are severe enough to endanger his life.
I don't know if it was attempted suicide, was it an accident, incident, whatever. It happened, and it made him even bigger.
This program is made possible in part by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Richard Pryor walked you through his life and you saw it. He put you right there. You was on the corner with the rhino. You was on the corner. My government name is Tracy Morgan. I'm a human being, and I'm funny. He never lied to us. When you listen to Richard Pryor talk on stage, it was just a funny conversation. And that's what attracted me to stand up. If I'm gonna tell a story on stage, it's gonna be with detail and color. You know, I learned my honesty and I learned my ability to connect with audiences and to be vulnerable through watching Richard Pryor. I'm not very religious, but I don't hang on the Pope's every word. I know people that do, and that must be what that's like. You know, to have somebody that you see that becomes a kind of a guiding light for you.
Well, Richard Pryor is the comedy icon. He was known everywhere, and he was a true ambassador to comedy. He is mentioned in the same loving reverence as all those other great humanitarians that weren't comedians.
What other comedians do I think Richard Pryor influenced? Are you crazy? You name me a comedian had to, through some way, have been influenced by Richard Pryor, because we call him the king. We call him the greatest. From Robin Williams, from Robin Harris, J. Anthony Brown, Bruce, Louis C.K., George Carlin, Don Rickles, I know Jerry Seinfeld. You name me a comedian, Carrot Top, everybody was influenced by Richard Pryor.
For Richard Pryor, his stirring journey that changed the world began the first time he appeared on television. Something a comedian never forgets.
On Broadway tonight, for the first time on television, Richard Pryor.
The very first time I was ever on TV doing stand-up, it happened so quick that I didn't even have time to get nervous.
I'm going to tell you a few things about myself, because a lot of you probably don't know me. I'm not a New Yorker. My home's in Pryor, Illinois.
They asked me, did I have 7 minutes? So I said, yeah, and he said, go on stage, and I was on stage, so I didn't have time.
I'm from an average type family, 11 kids. No mother, father, just kids.
When you walk on stage now, and you know these people have paid to come see you.
I grabbed the crook. That was the wrong move.
I already know every night before I go on stage, I'm gonna have a good time, whether you like it or not.
He threw me down. I got to pick me down. I got to kick me down. He said, get up. I said, hey.
Then the next 5 to 7 minutes is a complete blur. It's out of body experience. I remember at one point I was up above myself, looking down at me, doing stand-up.
And my wife threw him across the front just to slap me. The police came, she beat them up. They took her away. Me and the crook living happily ever after.
And if you did well, the next day, you know, it all changes.
Even when he was supposedly square and legit, his heart was still in the streets. Dr. Todd Boyd, professor of critical studies, USC School of Cinematic Arts. This sort of perspective of a black man from this generation who's connected to the streets and how you use language to sort of communicate this was very familiar to me. Richard Pryor is interesting because he's someone who's from the Midwest and sort of moved through various low-level circuits in the Midwest and eventually made his way into New York.
Eddie's. That's right, I'm tired of telling you guys over and over. Every time I turn around, I gotta tell you. The torpedo tube's on the left, the laboratory's on the right.
You can take all the rancor out of it. You can take all the misogyny out of it, and you still have a very, very funny man. My name is Cecil Brown. I'm a friend of Richard Pryor. The comedy of Richard Pryor is universal. That kind of humor addresses the new millennium very well, very well. The type of comedy Richard was doing when I first met him was called white bread humor. No curse words. No references to anything such as race, sex, or drugs.
Last week we was watching television. I heard they knock on the door. I said to my wife, there's a knock on the door.
Richard starts out as a person imitating Bill Cosby.
To be great, you gotta study the greats. Bill Cosby was inspiration for Richard Pryor.
You know, this skinny guy in this, like, you know, suit that's too big. Richard Pryor was trying to be the best he could be.
I like New York City. I've been working in the village in coffee houses. And I like it because they don't serve any booze, just coffee, ice cream, weird pills.
I think Richard probably thought that he had to be like Bill to be in.
He's not sort of taking a strong political stand. He's not attempting to be confrontational. He's quite the opposite.
He started back in the day when there were no blacks on TV. And it was so long ago, it was only black and white TV. So you had to be either black or white. Either way, you had no choice.
I think he was just finding his way. You want to sell tickets and you want to be popular.
You guys are facetious. What do you say, man?
I don't know. You want to kill him?
What can I do to get some of these opportunities that are potentially available?
Here he is, our own little Richie Pryor.
Pryor's non-offensive physical style is gaining lots of attention. He is now a rising stand-up comic star and a frequent guest on the Merv Griffin syndicated talk show.
Every black person in America watched Richard Pryor.
How you do that, Richie? You just,
I don't know. I just kind of go out there and I just do it.
Because that's all we did. We never saw any black people back then. Everybody would call on the telephone. Everybody would go to everybody's house. If you didn't have a TV, you showed up at somebody's home with a television.
MFT, you're under arrest.
Now what do we do?
Smoke a cigarette. Tastes good. Maybe they smoke well.
He's funny, but that Richard Pryor is very different than the Richard Pryor who becomes popular in the 1970s. That's almost a different guy.
Despite his meteoric rise to success, Richard Pryor is restless. He's beginning to feel constrained on stage.
He's not fully expressing himself in the way that he would like. He's really an imitator of other comics.
As Pryor continues to perform a Bill Cosby style of comedy, the taste of American pop culture is now reflecting the swelling tides of social change and unrest. Nowhere is this reflected more than in New York City.
Richard taught me a lot of what not to do. He was definitely a role model of what not to do. He thought I was like the squarest guy on the planet. It was a very vibrant time in New York. There was social activism in the streets. If you weren't doing socially relevant material, you weren't really relevant yourself.
What's happening is this move away from, say, purely physical comedy, gags and stunts and skits, to what we might call more intellectual comedy, more political comedy.
Richard tried to be safe in the beginning. I don't think he found much happiness in trying to be somebody else.
In September 1967, Pryor has what he would later call an epiphany. Pryor was performing at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada.
And he would mention some of the Rat Pack people were sitting watching him.
He was on stage, and everybody in the audience sitting in jackets. You couldn't go to a show unless you had a jacket on and a shirt and tie. He was probably one of the few black people in the club.
And Richard sort of realizes that he's imitating this very square guy in Bill Cosby. He's not found his own voice.
And he thought their idea of him was of a joke, a ridiculous person. Comics want to entertain people, but they also want to keep their self-respect.
It kind of boiled over, and when he looked in the audience and saw him telling jokes to people that looked at him odd. I mean, if they're gonna look at you, at least have them look at you as a man.
Your self-respect is being challenged, and you take it very personal. And Richard said he was so embarrassed that he walked off the stage.
A very important turning point in his career, because this is the moment when he decides the old Richard Pryor is going to be laid to rest.
He walked off the stage in the wrong direction. And they told him, you gotta go back across the stage. And he said, no, I'm not going back across that stage.
It's almost poetic that this guy who in the next decade will become this huge star arrives at this point by walking away from something. It's working. It's a coming to consciousness. It's a transition from one phase to the next.
Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor was born December 1st, 1940 in Peoria, Illinois.
Peoria, Illinois is one of a number of Midwestern towns that would develop a sizable black population.
Pryor's father, Leroy Buck Carter Pryor, was a former Golden Gloves boxer and a pimp. His mother, Gertrude Thomas, was a bookkeeper and a prostitute.
I don't think one has to think too far and too long to imagine what it would be like to be the son of a prostitute.
Both parents were violent and alcoholic. His father rarely saw him, and his mother abandoned him when he was 10. Pryor would later reconcile with her.
So my real mother calls me up on the telephone and shocks me, man, and she comes up, and I'm really happy. That's my mother. Is she here? Oh, man, don't hide your face. She's beautiful, man. I just don't know. She's been trying to get in touch with me and stuff like that, and I didn't even know it.
his grandmother would be his sole means of support as a child.
Richard's grandmother ran a brothel, what Richard would call a hoe house. His mother worked in the brothel as a prostitute. Richard just happened to grow up in one of those many brothels.
Pryor's grandmother, Marie Carter, was a violent woman who would beat him for any of his mischief.
The environment is one, defined by abuse of all sorts.
Selfishly, we wanted more from it. We began to get it now. And you want someone that was that honest with you. Now that it's not there, and you always miss the water when the well is dry. My name is Roshan Khan, and I've been called Richard's bodyguard. But I would like to refer to it as one of his friends. The Richard Pryor story for me, being told, and who would tell it, and how would it be told. Because if it doesn't reflect Richard's honesty, it's a bullshit story. For him to say the mouth that would kiss me goodnight just performed this act, just to have that thought as a kid. And how many goodnight kisses did you get? How many acts did you see? Seeing the only white guys coming to your house are guys looking to get laid, and being a little kid and looking up and seeing these people had to be traumatic.
You gotta understand, Richard Pryor never had a normal life. Of course it's gonna be difficult.
Living in one of the worst slum areas in Peoria, young Pryor often found himself the target of gangs. His sense of humor was his only defense mechanism, and Pryor soon developed the reputation as a class cut-up. His difficult childhood would provide a wealth of material he would later mine for stand-up routines.
There are after-hours joints. The cops who come in these places, and the numbers runners, and various and sundry other individuals, and the way in which they spoke. These were the people Richard grew up around. These were the voices he heard as a child. This is the blueprint for everything he would do going forward.
With comedy, I always tell people it's a stew that for the first 18 years of your life is sitting on the stove, and all your life experiences get put into it, and it's bubbling. And if it cooks at the right temperature, like sometimes it's too high, sometimes it's too low, what you end up with at the end of that 18 years, or how many years for your development, I think that's what makes you who you are.
As a child, Pryor's escape from his troubled life was the silver screen. While seated in the black-only seats in local cinemas, he especially loved Westerns, stirring within the young child a wild ambition to become a star. Another unlikely Hollywood icon fueled Pryor's passion to perform.
My grandmother, when we moved, she had a bunch of records upstairs, old Doris Day records. I'd go upstairs and listen to those. Imagine I was in a play, and imagine I was in Hollywood.
for Richard, his circumstances were so dire that it was motivation. Can it get any worse? How do I get out of here? Well, if you're someone who's motivated, that can be a very good, instigator of change in your life. And I think for Richard Pryor it was.
Looking to escape the neighborhood he grew up in, Pryor joined the Army in 1958. Like Bill Cosby, Pryor saw the armed forces as an opportunity of advancement. However, due to a racially charged incident, he spent virtually the entire 2 years of his enlistment in an army prison in Europe for slashing a soldier with a switchblade. Upon his discharge from the Army, Pryor got his first cabaret gig at an African-American nightclub in Peoria, where he sang and played the piano.
In some ways, it sort of taught him a range of different show business styles. Richard's from an era when you might have to do anything. Maybe that night you needed to sing. Maybe this night you need to tell jokes. So you had to be familiar with all these things.
Realizing that audiences prefer his jokes to his singing, Pryor began to work as a comic in Midwestern all-black comedy clubs. In 1963, fueled by his ambition to become a star, he left the Midwest for New York City. He would hone his act in Greenwich Village nightclubs alongside a young George Carlin and Richie Havens. But growing up as an African American in a Peoria, Illinois brothel would be the blueprint of a life Richard Pryor could never escape.
If you grew up in a whorehouse, it's a pretty good chance that, you're going to bear some scars of that, as you grow up and become an adult.
So I think with Richard Pryor, he was the alchemist that was able to transform all of the tragedy into a drink that everybody wanted a sip of.
After walking off the stage in Las Vegas in September of 1967, Richard Pryor found himself banned from many nightclubs, allegedly due to offending the mob-connected nightclub owners.
Nobody walks out on Dean Martin and these big guys and all these people in the audience.
Back then it was in Variety and in Vegas they were like, we don't want them.
Now broke, he hitched a ride to Berkeley, California.
To take that and leave knowing that that was the way you made your living and just said, I'm not doing this, and go and find yourself with very little money.
Pryor was in the epicenter of the American counterculture.
Free speech movement, the SDS movement at Berkeley, and then later the Black Panther Party.
You had the whites protesting the war in Vietnam.
It's the height of sort of racial conflict, attempts at ending segregation in the South, the passing of the Civil Rights Act, followed by the Voting Rights Act. Very politically charged era.
In addition to that, you had the resurgence of drugs.
Richard's in the midst of all this. It's impossible to be there and not be touched by these things. He meets Huey P. Newton, head of the Black Panther Party. Richard talks about reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and how much that influenced him.
You couldn't separate Richard from the times.
I think what Richard experienced was in some ways akin to like a spiritual conversion. He, realized who he had been, an imitator, someone who was very good at imitating other people, but when you're imitating other people, you're not being your true self.
While at Berkeley, Pryor came to the realization that he couldn't sit on the sideline and watch the social and racial inequality that surrounded him continue unopposed. He needed to be involved. He needed to make a difference with his comedy.
You ever notice how nice white people get when there's a bunch of niggas around? Right, they get outside, they talk to everybody, right? They say, hi, how you doing? I don't know you, but here's my wife. Hello.
While on sabbatical in Berkeley, Richard Pryor finds his voice.
Well, this is the fun part for me when the white people come back after intermission and find out niggas done stole their seats. You niggas taking a chance being in Long Beach, though, Jack. I saw the police had some brother jacked up when we was coming in here. Niggas' hands way up here, talking about, huh? What? They're searching the shit. Bet they take him away to jail.
When he came to Berkeley, he said he wanted to do something completely different. Otherwise, he was going to finish with doing comedy.
There was times I had to throw my whole act away and say, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do my material the way this is my life. This is what I did. This is what it was before show business.
And what he did in Berkeley was completely different, was to invoke all of those taboo subjects like race, sex, poverty, all the things he couldn't talk about on television. I remember thinking that was good, because I think comics are mostly anarchists. I'm all for anarchy as long as I can keep room service.
Pryor left Berkeley with a rejuvenated career.
I think his career was over when he walked off the stage of the Aladdin. But that career, he wanted to be over. I think a new Richard Pryor was born. And I think all those people that were mad because he walked off, I think they'd never book him again until they were made to book him again, because his popularity had superseded their prejudice, their ignorance and their stupidity. Because Richard Pryor